Hey there, and thank you for tapping into this episode of Bandwidth Coast to Coast. I'm going to start this episode with the definition, just to set some of the stage. Here it is. What is an industry? When people refer to this or that, quote, industry, what is the idea they're modeling with that? Well, it's a conglomeration of companies that sell products or services within a specific domain. For example, companies that sell birdseed could be in the home and garden industry, while those that sell dog food, the pet industry, so on and so forth. Now, musing for a moment, what could happen to an industry if the rules of where something can be made were artificially held in place? How would that industry, again, that conglomeration of companies, and the markets, which are nothing more than people and companies that are interested in purchasing that industry's goods, how would they react if such an artificial control was in place? Lucky for us, we don't have to look any further than America's domestic shipping industry, and more specifically the Jones Act, or the artificial control in place that mandates all ships being used to transport goods domestically be built in America and operated by mostly American crews. During this interview, we go into the reasoning when the act was put into place, subsequently how far the U.S. has fallen since the Industrial Revolution in shipbuilding, which then sets the stage for the modern pushback and general lazy obedience to the status quo and lack of political will on this topic. As my returning guest Colin Grabow details, forcing ships to be built only in America breeds a lack of specialization into the U.S. shipyards, which then means a lack of efficiency and a lack of standardization, which are all the hallmarks of not just better products, but reduced costs. As such, the U.S. builds a dizzyingly slow number of ships each year, despite the size of the water domestically and the wealth of the nation. To me, it's a really fascinating example around the idea of the role of government and how products get made and made well. Well, with all that, I'll bring us to our interview with Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, Colin Grabow. Real quick before the episode starts, if you'd like to listen to us on your streaming platform of choice, donate to the show, sign up for our mailing list, visit us at bandwidthpodcast.com. And of course, if you like what you hear, follow, comment, or subscribe to the pod from wherever you're listening. Enjoy! All right. Well, thank you again for dealing with our scheduling shuffle to come back on. Appreciate your time. And thank you for coming on again. So today we're going to be focusing on the Jones Act and kind of unpacking what exactly that is. But before we do that, would you mind just introducing yourself? And then I have a quick question that's kind of setting us up like last time. And then we'll dive into the subject matter.
Well, thanks for having me on once again. My name is Colin Grabow, and I am a policy analyst at the Cato Institute's Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies.
Awesome. And I imagine you're very busy at these time of days.
Always.
Okay, so we had you on before, and I have a question I ask everybody when they first join, which is, what do you do that makes you happy? And then the second one I like to ask if they're a returning guest is, what have you done recently that has made you happy?
Yeah. So, last time I think I talked about, my love of soccer, but another thing that makes me happy and something that I've been able to do since then has brought me happiness, and I think will continue to bring me happiness is I enjoy learning and just adding to my level of knowledge. I think I just enjoy trying to we live in a very complicated world, and trying to better understand our world is just a great intellectual exercise, and brings a lot of satisfaction when you can solve one of those many riddles that are around us and try to figure out why are things the way they are. And so I just say since then, recently I've continued to read, continue to learn, and all that brings you more satisfaction. And one of the joys of getting older is you accumulate more knowledge, and I think it helps you to better understand the world we live in. So I'd like to think that every day I've got a little bit closer to understanding a little bit more about the world in which we all live.
I like that. Yeah, a big part of the reason I do this is because I enjoy learning so much. So I can definitely resonate with that. Anything you've been learning about recently that was particularly tantalizing?
Oh, it just all has to do with ships. So I'm sure we'll get into that enough. So
That's great. Okay, so today we're going to talk about. Oh, by the way, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation about the sugar cartel. That's just especially with more of the kind of government programs continually getting bigger and bigger and
yeah.
bigger, and kind of the second, third, and unintended effects of those type of programs. So I appreciate you again for that. Also, I got to just say one more time, I love the title of that, a candy coated sugar cartel. I think it's very well pointed. It's very humorous to a not so humorous subject. So today we're going to talk about the Jones Act. So I want to ask you first to just let me know what the Jones Act is, and then I'm going to kind of do what I did last time and move out in concentric circles.
Great. So the Jones Act is the colloquial name applied to Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. And this provision, Section 27, has four main provisions, requirements, and that's that for any vessel transporting goods within the United States by water, it has to meet four conditions. That's that the vessel has to be flagged and registered in the United States, just like you register your car in a certain state. That vessel has to be U.S. registered as opposed to another country. It has to be at least 75% U.S. crude with American citizens. The other 25% can be, I believe, permanent residents, so green card holders. The vessel has to be at least 75% U.S. owned, and the vessel has to be built here in the United States, which is an extremely unusual provision because any other form of transportation, trucks, rail, pretty much anything does not have to be built in the United States. You can get it from wherever, but when it comes to things afloat, they have to be built here in the United States.
That's curious. So you said that 1929, is that what you said? That was
1920.
1920. Okay.
Yes.
What was
So
the
it's
own it?
turned 100 years, June of last year, turned 100 years old.
And the bill's coming due. Uh, what was the onus of this? So it's 1920. The World War I has just ended, and the kind of the credit markets heating up and international trade. I think there's a graph I looked at once, and it was like international trade or cross Atlantic trade pre World War I and after, and it exploded. So that's a little bit of the setting. So what was the onus of making it at then?
So the impetus, so like I said, the Jones Act was one section of a much larger piece of legislation called the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, and had all these many different provisions. So what was the impetus for the Merchant Marine Act? And it was designed to do several things, but I think the biggest driver, the biggest impetus was simply the fact that, as you mentioned, the U.S. had just come out of World War I. During World War I, the United States did not have enough ships to transport its troops and equipment from the United States over to France. And so in response, we engaged in this crash shipbuilding program. The U.S. entered the war in 1917, April 1917, if I recall correctly. Ships can't be built overnight. It takes a while to both, expand the shipyards, get them up to speed, and then build the actual ships. So I think a majority of the ships built for use in World War I were actually completed after November of 1918 when the armistice was signed. Anyway, the point is, the United States found itself with this huge fleet of ships that just built during World War I. They were all owned by the government. And the question was, well, what do we do with them? So that's what the purpose of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, one of the biggest goals of it was to figure out what to do with all these ships, how do we dispose of them and get them off the government's hands. But while they were at it, they thought, well, since we're dealing with this, merchant marine ship issue, why don't we also look at kind of the issue more broadly of factors impacting the U.S. merchant marine? And there were some shipping companies in Seattle, Washington, and they thought, well, this is a good opportunity for us to get our voice heard. And they were very upset about the fact that Americans who want to send goods to Alaska, instead of using American ships out of Seattle, they were sending their goods by train or truck up to Vancouver, Canada, putting them on foreign ships in Vancouver and going to Alaska. Now, why were they doing this, even though Vancouver's further away? It's because foreign ships were much cheaper than American ships. And so these shipping companies in Seattle said, well, we don't want to compete with these foreign ships. And they went and testified before Congress in 1920. And the person running the committee was Senator Wesley Jones of Washington State, for whom the Jones Act is named. And they said, look, we hate all these foreigners taking business from us. We don't have to compete against foreign ships in the Alaska market. And we think it'd be a great idea if you amended existing language to bar this from happening. And that's why Section 27 was included. If you look at the language of Section 27, it's basically like 85% the same as what these shipping companies proposed. Because U.S. shipping, today as then was very expensive, or I should say then as today is very expensive, and people were looking for a way around it. And it was basically trying to close a loophole that would deny Americans access to cheaper foreign shipping.
Interesting. I'm going to come back to that, but I'm going to ask for a definition first. What is a merchant marine?
Merchant marine is the commercial shipping in the United States that it's considered, some have called the fourth arm of defense, along with the Navy, Air Force, and Army, because although it's commercial and civilian manned, in time of war, it plays a crucial role. And that the United States, when we need to transport our bullets, our bombs, cans of beans to our troops all around the world, they rely on ships. And the US Navy doesn't have a huge number of transport ships, so they have to turn to the commercial sector to meet their needs. And that commercial sector is the U.S. Merchant Marine, which is basically all the U.S. flagged ships.
So if you are a U.S. flagged commercial ship and you're moving anything from Amazon cargo to coal, you are considered a member of the Merchant Marine.
You are considered a member of the Merchant Marine. It's actually worth noting that you're aware that we have the different service academies, the Air Force Academy, West Point for the Army and whatnot. There's also a U.S. Merchant Marine Academy in Kings Point, New York, and that is considered a service academy, and it's funded by the federal government. And students, go there free of tuition. So it's treated in many ways the same as the U.S. military. So that kind of speaks to the significance that it plays, even though it's civilian and commercial, the role that it plays in U.S. military thinking.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, do they actually organize themselves in any type of chain that goes up to the Pentagon or any type of organization of that, or only in wartime does that kind of occur?
So right now, the Merchant Marine comes under the auspices of the U.S. Maritime Administration, which is part of the Department of Transportation. And one of the interesting things about the Merchant Marine is, so on the one hand, it figures into U.S. military thinking and strategy. On the other hand, as I said, they're civilians. So a key difference is in wartime, obviously, members of the military have to report for duty. It's their contractual obligation to. Members of the Merchant Marine are not. They did not sign a contract saying that I'm a member of the U.S. military. So there's kind of this expectation that they will, but there's no ironclad assurance that they will. And so right now, I think one unfortunate aspect of our current policy is you can only kind of guess. You can say, well, we know how many merchant mariners there are, but in case of war, how many can we really count on? And you can only really guess what that is, because that's. I'm not trying to question anybody's patriotism here or willingness to serve, but sometimes life circumstances just interfere, and it's hard for people for various duties, for various reasons, to leave whatever they're doing and go perform wartime service. So it's an interesting situation that they straddle. They have kind of one foot in both worlds, the commercial and the military.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Especially considering, so I come from a military family, so there's a different mindset that you have when you sign up to be in the Army or any branch of service. Like you're kind of accepting of certain complexities when it comes to your family life, or even just your life in general, and how much it can get turned upside down. Where if you're just, like I said, shipping Amazon freight, and then all of a sudden you get called up, that's a bit. I would imagine that's a bit confusing or tenuous. Especially considering there hasn't been any attacks on the homeland that, you can say in September 11th, sure, but true attacks, wartime attacks in quite some time. So this is probably a pretty foreign concept that it can even be, called up.
Well, Mind, though, that given U.S. foreign policy being what it is, it doesn't require an attack on the U.S. homeland for the United States to go to war or for the merchant marine to be, called upon. We have examples, most recently, the Afghanistan and Iraq War campaigns. Those, required equipment and military supplies to be transported to Iraq and to I think Europe, where they were put on trains to eventually get to where they were needed in Afghanistan or whatever. And those required ships, and so merchant mariners were called upon. We also have one of the better known examples in recent decades is the Persian Gulf War, 1990-91. Huge military buildup. I think 500,000 soldiers, and those guys all need equipment, supplies, and U.S. Merchant Marine figured prominently there as well.
That's fascinating. I had no idea about that. The analog that I was thinking about was the inactive ready reserve, if you're familiar with them.
Yes.
So like you get out of the military, and depending on your contract in terms of service or various different complexities therein, you can get placed into this inactive ready reserve, which means in times of strain or stress on the numbers of military that there is, because of someone's expertise. It could take 9 months to a year to 2 years to train people, depending on what their expertise is. We just think like, oh, you're a communications guy in a unit, and we think like that's not that much of training, but those people actually have about a year of training because they're actually hacking satellites to make those type of things happen. So in those situations, if you are an officer or some type of highly technical individual, you'll get actually redrafted, even though technically you've been out of the Army for whatever the amount of time is. Which is similar to me in the Iraq War, when we were having the surge and all of that. That was one of the instances where these individuals, where historically for the past some decades, have never been called on, and almost was looked at as a you're in the inactive ready reserve, but you're not going to get called on, and then all of a sudden they were. So it's interesting to me. That was kind of the analog, but I had no idea about that. It makes sense logistically, right? There's like a great quote. I think it was Marcus Aurelius, one of the ancient generals, where they said that war is logistics, it's not battles. So it makes sense to me that you would want to have this type of system in place, because you need bullets, you need food, you need medical supplies, sometimes you just need clean water, which you would need to, ships is obviously, like in a lot of places, the easiest way to get that in there. So that makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so thank you for framing up what merchant marine is, and shedding some light on that complexity I had no idea about. So going back to Vancouver and the 1920, so there's this big buildup of excess ships that were built for wartime, while at the same time there's some emerging complexities with international markets, such as it is that it's cheaper to use other foreign ships and crews than it is to use Americans. So kind of the special interest of that in Mr. Jones, the senator from Washington, as well as kind of we're sitting on this supply of ships. Let's write it into law. How well did it work out in the beginning? Was it a policy success? And is it something that is kind of a holdover from like a law where it's you can't have a crocodile tied up to a fire hydrant or something like that, and it just kind of has stayed in place? Or is it something that has been nurtured to kind of take hold? Does that make sense?
It's absolutely a law that it's an old law that is stayed in place, I think, because various special interests have attached themselves to it and have an extreme self-interest in maintaining the status quo. It's useful to remember, as I said before, the Jones Act was aimed at kind of tweaking or adjusting existing laws to keep out foreigners from the Alaska market. But the Jones Act is a cabotage law. It applies to transportation within the United States and the abilities of foreigners to participate or not participate in that domestic commerce. People think the Jones Act is old because it's 100 years old, almost 101 years old. But in fact, I think properly viewed, it's far older than that. U.S. cabotage laws go back to the very founding of our country. Back in, I believe, 1789, the first measure was passed. It was like the third act of Congress, I believe, that said foreign ships transporting goods in the United States, they're allowed to do it, but they were subject to extremely high taxes. So, by law, they could transport goods within the United States, but on a de facto basis, once you factored in the taxes, it almost didn't make any sense. And then by 1817, the US just flatly said no foreign ships are allowed to transport goods within the United States, period. Oh, and by the way, ships that operate in the United States, they also have to be built in the United States. Now, an argument you'll hear from pro-Jones Act supporters is, well, this just shows the wisdom of the founding fathers, and the Jones Act reflects what they knew. And just as the Constitution isn't a bad idea just because it's so old, neither is the Jones Act. But the context is entirely different between now and then. Back then, I mentioned that U.S. shipping has become very expensive, so people were looking for these loopholes of ways to get around it, like going through Vancouver. Back then, it was the complete opposite. U.S. shipping and shipbuilding was some of the best in the world. That's not a big surprise. The 13 original colonies were all along the water. We had these big forests full of timber, perfect to build ships with. So we had people that were familiar with shipping, familiar with shipbuilding, had all the natural resources there to do it. In fact, the British, back when we were part of the British Empire, I think something like a huge percentage of the ships in the British fleet were built in the United States, in the British commercial fleet, because the Americans were renowned as excellent shipbuilders. Well, all that is totally different today. We've gone from being some of the best shipbuilders in the world to some of the worst, just as measured by the prices that we charge and how long it takes to build a ship. We've gone from being some of the least expensive and most efficient shipping companies to, again, some of the least efficient and most expensive shipping companies. So some historians will even tell you that back then, these initial measures were cost-free because being forced to use an American flagged, American-built ship was no big deal because they were some of the cheapest anyway. But the world has definitely changed for the worse in terms of U.S. shipping and shipbuilding. Now, instead of being forced to use some of the cheapest and best shipping and shipbuilding, Americans are forced to use some of the most expensive ships in the world and some of the most expensive shipping in the world.
That's fascinating. Yeah, the context from the founding is great, especially how that's unfortunate how it's being manipulated. But the big basis of the economy for the colonies was sending goods elsewhere. So, that right there, shipping was the mode of transportation back then. Just like a sideways plug as far as like guns, germs, and steel, kind of that kind of thing, is, the first colonies that came here in America before disease kind of took hold. A lot of the areas like Pennsylvania is always the example I use. It's Latin for Penn's forest. Before disease kind of took hold and wiped out a lot of the indigenous groups, that was actually a lot of managed prairie land, which is so fertile, then all of a sudden it exploded. So, forest canopies may have been like 40%, exploded to, nearing 100%. So then, the first kind of travelogues you see is like, oh my God, there's great pasture land. And then the next travelogues that you see is, oh my God, there's all this great timber for shipbuilding. It's something I've actually mentioned in a different interview. But Pennsylvania or, any of those type of coastal regions, had perfect timber for shipbuilding. And it was something that both, internationally was really encouraged. And I can understand from like a domestic stability point. And if you read some of like the founding fathers and even some of the Federalist Papers sideways mention it, is the necessity to create an economy based off of this shipping, because they wanted to not necessarily compete with these world powers in Europe, but be able to not be influenced by them, to be able to have their own domestic market, because they saw that, well, hey, like if we are able to continually flow goods in and out of here, it's going to be, in our advantage, which back to like the Marines, the U.S. Marines, not just merchant Marines, they have in their song, like off the shores of Tripoli, which is also the example of this I always love. From the
halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli.
Yeah, which is the U.S. ships
that were in
pirates, exactly, that were in the Mediterranean were getting continually attacked until Thomas Jefferson sent over a brigade of Marines to burn down Tripoli and kind of hold the
fascinating story.
Yeah, to hold the pirates. He pirated the pirates and went from giving them a tribute every year to the other way around, which is just fascinating, and also kind of goes to the nature of America has always been one to encourage commerce in this kind of international community. of ships and I mean not necessarily shipping, but just trade, if you will, which
Commerce,
is
yeah, sure.
commerce and trade. So it's interesting because back then I could see it as a national security as well as from national security of making sure that we have enough ships to be able to defend ourselves, but also to not like that soft diplomacy of being able to have commerce.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but you bring up a
Yeah, go
great
ahead.
point here, because that's another key difference between the context of then and now. Is that back then, not only did we have great shipbuilding, cheap shipping, very competitive shipping, but also ships back then. During the Revolutionary War, during the War of 1812, the United States didn't have a huge fleet. We were a poor country. But one way you could compensate for that was you take these merchant ships, you put some cannon on them, and they could serve as privateers. Now, there's no such thing as a privateer today. We have, the world's best Navy. We don't need to do that. It would be unfeasible, to put cannon on a container ship. That would do nothing for you. So that also just speaks to a completely different world that we inhabit today, versus then.
Yeah, incredible specialization versus ad hoc being able to kind of keep up. Like this is something I talk about a lot, is that the bounds of technology has gone so off the rails in a way where like you can't take a warship. A warship is a warship, and sometimes by the time you get them on the water, they're already outdated. Versus back then, the delta between a commercial ship and a warship wasn't as large. So being able to tool something is completely differently, which kind of goes
even
to your
even within commercial shipping, because there used to be a time when cargo ships weren't that different. They were just ships that had a big hold in them. And you just put whatever in there. And now, even among cargo ships, they're so specialized, so differentiated. You have liquefied petroleum gas tankers, tankers just for one product. You have tankers that are even geared towards transporting juice. You have general cargo ships. You have container ships. So you have ships that are designed to carry bulk products like grain. So even just the ships that transport commercial goods are so specialized today. It's an incredible difference.
Yeah, and to your point, and that goes back to the global trade, right? Like, because one route might specialize in some sort of exchange, which would then create a hyper. Well, it creates the space so that, for example, if I wanted to create a ship that's just for grain, well, now I have a route that this is grain is shipped enough on this that it makes sense.
Yeah.
But then even to your point again, we're kind of reaching this nexus point in my eyes as far as efficiencies when it comes to fossil fuels and things like that. We need economies of scale, and our trade is just getting larger and larger and larger. So even container ships, like we're seeing with the Suez Canal and the Ever Given, is it makes sense to make a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger cargo ship. But then we're starting to see kind of the complexities that happen when you do that, either with our infrastructure in the case of the Suez Canal, and not necessarily being built in such a way that would contend with something like that happening. But even what we're seeing with China, which is we don't have, there's little inefficiencies or necessities like not having enough containers to be able to get ships over here, right? Or parts getting squeezed out. Like I saw something recently about like how exercise equipment is causing the amount of price of all goods and shipping to go up because exercise equipment is so heavy and so big. And it's oftentimes like the example that was given was Peloton. So the way Pelotons are assembled, they actually don't stack very well. And they take up a lot of space versus the volume and weight that they are. So that all kind of, it makes sense. We're in this nexus point where nowadays it's a whole different world than 17 or 1817. I have a question about the fact that our shipbuilding went from being, the best and the brightest to not being the greatest. It is part of this specialization in shipbuilding part of the reason for this, and by that being ships are made with steel now and not made with wood. They're highly computerized, which would be good on our end because we make most of the semiconductors. But what is it that goes into the less efficiency? Is it that there hasn't? I mean, is it just the cost of labor is more? Is that we haven't been investing in our ports and infrastructure to be able to have a bit better ship making? Has it shifted to more military budgets as opposed to civilian, or what from there?
So the short version is this: industries that are not forced to compete will not be competitive. These shipbuilders were handed a captive domestic market. Americans, if they want to ship goods by water within the United States, we have to buy from U.S. shipyards. They have a captive market, so that's reduced incentive to innovate and compete. But if you want, the longer explanation, as you kind of hinted at, U.S. is great so long as we were living in a world of sail and wood. But that changed starting, I think, the 1830s, 1840s, and then accelerating in the 50s and 60s. We saw the switch from wood to iron, and then later steel, and from sail to steam. And the British, who led the Industrial Revolution, were great on the steel and steam fronts, and they took over as world leaders in shipbuilding. In the United States, well, they had built the world famous clipper ships, back in the 1830s, which sailed at record-setting speeds and were very efficient. But that didn't do you a whole lot of good in a world governed by iron and steam. But the U.S., instead of competing and innovating, they just kind of stuck with what they knew. And I believe that as late as 1890, a majority of the U.S. fleet was still wood and sail fleets. And you also brought up labor costs. Interestingly, that was cited for a long time as why U.S. built ships were more expensive, because the U.S. built premium, that's not something that just happened in recent decades. You can go back to, I think, like the 1860s, 1870s and find examples of U.S. built ships being 50 to 70% more expensive than foreign built ships. And back then, Americans were paid more. Labor costs were more than foreigners. But today, we're in this bizarre situation where a container ship can cost 5 times more in the United States than abroad, and yet Americans get paid less than many of the foreign countries that are building these ships. American shipbuilders actually get paid less than the Japanese. They get paid less than the South Koreans. The only major shipbuilder that I'm aware of that pays higher wages or lower wages than Americans is China. I think it's something like, Americans are like $23 and the Chinese are 13, something like that. But it's also a mistake to think that the cheapest is simply a product of who has the lowest wages, because what it comes down to is not it comes down to productivity, right? It's efficiency. How much bang for the buck, exactly. How much bang for the buck are you getting out of these workers? If you're paying someone $40 an hour and they're producing $80 worth of stuff, and you're paying someone else, $20 an hour and you're getting $25 worth of stuff, what's really the better deal there? So that's why, if you look around, it's not as though the U.S. has no auto manufacturing, for example. I believe we're number 2, number 3 in the world, something like that, in terms of auto production. Aerospace, Boeing, they didn't move all their plants down to Mexico. Boeing manufactures here in the United States and is a world leader in aerospace. So, a few things. U.S. had reduced incentive to innovate and compete. They had this captive domestic market. And then with that comes an issue of scale. To be truly efficient, you need to build at scale. American shipyards total, all shipyards combined, in an average year right now build, in terms of large ocean-going commercial ships, 2 or 3 per year. Last year they built 1. This year they're on track to build 2. Next year they're projected to build 0. These are extremely low economies of scale. Shipbuilding is hugely capital intensive. All the equipment, the cranes, everything you need, the steel cutting equipment, it's all hugely expensive. Now, if you're building 2 ships a year, total, think about one shipyard. You may build 1 ship every 2 years. How you can't spread your fixed costs. But if you're a South Korean yard and you're building 50 ships a year, you have so many more ships to spread those fixed costs across. Also, if you're a South Korean shipyard, you're building 50 ships, and you go to an engine manufacturer and you say, yeah, I'd like to place an order for 50 engines, you're going to get a very different price than if someone says, I'd like to order 2. Your leverage is just, it's incredibly different. Or when you go and say, here's how much steel I want to buy. and you're ordering enough steel for 50 ships, just different economies of scale. And then lastly, you have to talk about specialization. You want to get good at something, you need to build a lot of it and you need to specialize in it. And Americans are the opposite. We don't build very much. And we build a wide variety of things because, again, if you need a vessel in the United States, it has to come from an American shipyard. So in a more rational world, you'd say, okay, I need to buy a dredging vessel. Well, the Dutch are the best at that, so I'll go there. Or I need to buy an icebreaker. I'll go to Finland. I need to buy a container ship. I'll go to, South Korea or China. I need a liquefied petroleum gas carrier. I'll go to South Korea, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas in the United States, it's like, well, I need a dredging vessel. Well, I need to go to an American shipyard. I need, this vessel. I need to go to an American shipyard. So the reality or the end result is that we build very few vessels, and then American shipyards are kind of helter skelter. In that one year, I'm thinking of VT Halter Shipyard in Mississippi. They'll build, a articulated tug barge, which is it's a barge with a tugboat attached to it, and then they'll build a container ship, and then they'll build an icebreaker for the Coast Guard. They're just kind of all over the place in what they're building. They don't take one thing and specialize in it. Rather, they're kind of all over the place, and the end result is just a lack of competitiveness, as reflected in the prices they charge.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it probably would take a lot of specialization of just knowledge, right? Like, what do you need to know in order to build a ship, an icebreaker?
Yeah, and there's also like there's a learning curve there, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you get an order for someone says, I'm going to place an order for 15 ships. Well, the first one you kind of, okay, this is a new kind of ship, and you figure out as you go. Well, the second and third one, you can take the lessons learned from building those first few ships and apply those. Well, as an American, you rarely ever get an order for more than 2 ships at a time of a certain model. So those learning curve effects, by the time you've really gotten great at building that type of ship, you're not building any more of them. It's on to the next one. So
that's fascinating. That makes a lot of sense. Like I work in software development, and iteration is like a tenet of software development. You start with the easiest thing you could build first, and you kind of build up there. And then you're constantly going back on what you built and said, like, is there a better way we could have done that? Can we do that differently going forward? But that's when we're focusing in on a one single product, right? One single thing, where this is, you have to be quite manic. And I would imagine if there was a demand or, a market for it, some type of modularity and building would be great. But if you're only building, less than a handful, you're building, pairs or single one-offs of ships, you're not going to get any of that type of efficiency. Which is interesting. And the captive market thing, I think, is an interesting point that I wanted to highlight, because it's similar to the sugar in the sense that you own the individual shipyards don't own the market, but they're forced actors where there's no other game in town. So you're kind of having, it's a perfect storm of problems, really, now that I'm understanding it more. Because you have a market that's required to be, built and staffed as well, which I want to get into, with certain individuals or built in a certain place. And then on top of it, it's not the greatest, it's more expensive, which some of these logistical issues that I've been reading about with COVID make a little bit more sense, which I want to ask you a question before I go on to labor. So for example, there's a delay right now on anything that's coming to America from China and specific. Like you can see in like orders or things that are out of stock. It's getting a little bit better now. So let's just say there's an order for, I'm going to keep using Amazon, a number of Amazon goods that's going to go to the port of Los Angeles or Long Beach. It's going to get put on rail and distributed out there. Does that ship need to be American built, American staffed, or can it be Chinese built and Chinese staffed, even though it's manufactured and built there?
International commerce is not subject to the Jones Act. So if goods are coming from a foreign port, there's no Jones Act does not apply, and it can be international. So there's an excellent chance that ship coming into a U.S. port could be flagged in Hong Kong, crewed by Indians, owned by Japanese. It's very polyglot. Multinational experience. I can't think of an industry more international than shipping, in fact.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so if it's coming from Hong Kong or coming from Shanghai or something along those lines and going into the U.S. ports, it's not subject to it. But if it's going from Miami to Los Angeles and it's going through the Panama Canal, then now all of a sudden it's subject to this
Yeah,
domestic rules?
provided that if a ship picks up a good in an American port and drops off another American port, it's subject to the Jones Act. But you do have situations where a foreign ship will come over from Europe, say from Rotterdam, and it will head to New Jersey. It'll stop in New Jersey and it'll drop off some goods, and then it'll head down to say Wilmington, North Carolina, and it'll drop off some more goods. That's perfectly legit, provided those goods it's dropping off also came from Europe. It can't pick up something in New York and then drop it off in Wilmington. Or it can stop in Wilmington and then head down to Miami, and it'll pick up goods in Miami that are headed for an overseas destination. So as long as everything is dropping off and picking up, or either headed for abroad or being imported, it's all perfectly fine.
Interesting. Would this type of, I'm going to say game, this type of game of how the rules are set up, does it encourage more international trade versus domestic trade?
100%, absolutely. That's one of the interesting things about the Jones Act, is that it's often presented as, hey, this is an epitome of America first, right? I mean, these are American crewed, American flagged, American owned, American built ships. This is so great. This promotes the American economy. And that's the thinking. And obviously it's easy to understand why someone would think about, but the actual result is the complete opposite. Because when you force Americans to use these very expensive ships, it's a disincentive to buying American products, because you know that they'll have to come on American ships. So we have numerous examples of people importing goods from abroad rather than buying American products, because once you factor in the cost of transportation, it doesn't make any sense to buy American. Maybe the most famous or notorious example of this is in New England and Puerto Rico. Both locations import liquefied natural gas from abroad. In fact, both have had examples of importing it from as far away as they've imported Russian natural gas, which is interesting because we have natural gas coming out our ears here in the United States. We are an energy superpower. But when it comes to both places, they can't buy American natural gas, even if they wanted to by ship, because there are 0 Jones Act ships qualified to transport natural gas. There are no Jones Act LNG carriers in the fleet of 96 ships. Now, a lot of people hear that and they think, okay, well, this seems like an easy problem to solve. You go build the ship, you crew with Americans, and then you can transport it. What's so difficult about that? But when you factor in the cost of shipbuilding, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. According to the Wall Street Journal, to build an LNG carrier in Asia costs about $180 million. To build one in the United States costs $700 million. So that's over $500 million more for one ship, just one ship. Who in their right mind is ever going to build it? The math doesn't pencil out. No one's going to do that. So the ship doesn't get built. So Puerto Rico is like, we'd like to buy American natural gas, but it's not even an option for us because there are no ships to transport it. We have other examples. Like I remember reading a year or two ago about California was importing crude oil from Nigeria rather than the Gulf Coast. Because again, you factor in the cost of transportation, just doesn't make sense. 2013, the GAO did a study of the Jones Act's impact on Puerto Rico, and they talked to people in the agricultural community there, and they said, when we go to buy feed or fertilizer, we buy it from foreign sources like Canada, because again, once you factor in the cost of transportation, it doesn't make sense to buy American. Last example, again off the top of my head, the Department of Agriculture on their website talks about Puerto Rico importing rice from China instead of the southeastern United States, which actually is a fairly significant rice producer. I think like Arkansas and a few other states produce rice in decent amounts. And one reason it gave was the Jones Act, because of the high expense of Jones Act shipping. It makes more sense to ship all the way from China than from the southeast United States because of the high cost of shipping.
That makes sense. It's similar to like any experience I'm sure people have had online. When I've been having this experience with Etsy lately, where I go in and I'm like, oh man, this is awesome. It's, whatever amount of affordable price. This is great. I'm going to buy it. And then all of a sudden I realize the shipping is 4 times the amount of the actual good, which the natural gas is most interesting to me because I don't know the exact number. I think Russia may be close, but I'm pretty sure the United States has more liquefied natural gas ports than anywhere else. I know we have more under construction as well. because, okay, so natural gas comes out of the ground, and if you want to transport it, you turn it into liquid, because the volume that you create on there actually makes it a lot more cost effective to transport as a liquid as opposed to a gas, kind of water versus air kind of thing, like how much water is in the air versus, pumping it into liquid form, you can get a lot more. So it's fascinating to me that I can understand Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is an interesting case study for a lot of trade on tax stuff as well, especially pharmaceuticals. But anyways, so that's interesting that the second order effect of it is actually decreased domestic production or domestic trade because of the fact that in some of these areas where you need to bring in by ship, it just doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, and I just like to point out, sorry to interrupt, but
go ahead. Go ahead.
We're a huge country. I mean, this is a country that stretches from, Puerto Rico to Alaska and Hawaii and Guam even. It's a massive country. Distance is a barrier to trade that needs to be overcome. You need efficient transport options to overcome that. And traditionally, most places in the world, shipping, the use of water transport is one means of overcoming that distance and is efficient means of transportation. And yet we've come to this absurd situation where we only really use ships in this country where we have no other options. Like if you're shipping something to Hawaii, you can't use rail, you can't use truck, you have to use a ship. Or Puerto Rico. And I have to think that absent the Jones Act, fortunately in the 48 contiguous states, well, there are no ships. Okay, well, I can use the truck, I can use rail, I have other options. But I would think that in the Jones Act's absence, we would see ships operating along our coasts, and that would become one of several a menu of options. But it basically doesn't exist because it's priced itself out of competitiveness, so out of existence. So the only ships that operate within the United States, the contiguous states, are tankers, and even then, oftentimes they only go because there's no pipeline available. For example, the airport in Miami, there's no pipeline that goes to Florida, so jet fuel for the airport in Miami has to be brought in by water. If we had a fully developed pipeline network, I even wonder how many tanker ships we'd be using in this country.
Wow, which actually kind of goes back to the domestic security of it all. Actually, it's created a situation where it's self-perpetuating itself in the opposite direction now.
Well, exactly. If the logic is, we need to be self-reliant because relying on foreigners is dangerous. Well, we've come to a place where, we encourage Americans to rely on foreigners, including for critical products like energy. Again, we have examples of Puerto Rico and New England both importing natural gas from Russia. Now, to be clear, Russia isn't their primary supplier, but there have been times where that has actually happened. So it's a very curious thing. It's a disincentive to self-reliance, which again is kind of the opposite of what the Jones Act lobby suggests the law is meant to accomplish.
Yeah, it's interesting. Rhetoric versus reality is often a duality. The example that I would like to plug. So I'm a huge car nut, and in the 70s, American cars were terrible. Not that I lived through it, but I know they were terrible. And you had like the all those acronyms for Ford, Fixer, Repair Daily, and things like that. And then you had Japanese cars start entering the market, particularly Toyota. That was all of a sudden entering Honda and entering the market. And even with tariffs and everything, they were still able to compete quite well. But the biggest thing to it, which then again shocked again in kind of the 2008 financial crisis when a lot of automakers failed, was the amount of issues or just the quality of the build was so much higher on foreign cars, and it created better American cars. So like myself personally, I won't buy any GMs because they still have a lot of issues, if you ask me. But Ford has really stepped up, and how were they able to step up? And they were I think they were the only major automaker in 2008 that didn't take a bailout. And how they were able to do that is they had this great European division competing with European and Japanese or Asian cars, that they just actually brought their model line from Europe over. So the Ford Fusion was the first one they did this on. That was actually a European car. And the quality all of a sudden got up. Now, why did that happen? Well, because necessity breeds invention, right? They were required in the market, if you want to use market terminology, to create better cars because people weren't purchasing them, which then all of a sudden created a better quality product for everybody, and the market kind of stabilized. So Nowadays, sure, like you can make arguments of, maybe the balance for American cars should be different. For some reason, Tesla is always absent from those conversations. But it's similar here, where you're going, because of these required legislations of purchasing, from an American manufacturer and all of that, you're actually not requiring any amount of efficiency or quality into the system. So what it ends up doing is creating a worse and worse product, which it seems that the lobby is using as a reason to be able to kind of go further entrench itself, which is not surprising but disappointing, I suppose.
I think that's a great point. Using the auto example, sometimes I get asked by people. They say, "What do you think would happen if tomorrow we got rid of that U.S. built requirement? What would happen to the U.S. shipbuilding industry? I mean, would it collapse? What would happen?" And I think that autos offers an interesting example. I think a useful example where I think that they would have to get better, and the immediate impact would be rough. Yeah, when Toyota showed up on American shores and became available to American consumers, that was probably bad for American automakers. But in the long run, they're better for it. I think it would be the same with U.S. shipbuilding. I think that, like I mentioned before, they don't have a competitive niche. They're kind of they're jack of trade, master of none. And I think they would have to find that competitive niche. I mean, I look around the world, and as I said before, the Dutch are very, high wage country. They're very good at dredging vessels. The Norwegians are good at offshore service vessels used to supply oil platforms. The Finns are great at icebreakers. Western Europe dominates in the construction of large cruise ships. And you're going to tell me that Americans have nothing to offer the world in terms of shipbuilding? And this is another thing that strikes me about the Jones Act, is it's just so pessimistic. It assumes implicitly that Americans, they need to be protected because we can't compete. We're not good enough. We're subpar. And absent the Jones Act, shipbuilding would be obliterated. And I just find that unfair and just an indictment of their what they think about American workers and American ingenuity. I think this is a country that does amazing things. We designed the iPhone, and we have Elon Musk, building these rockets that go in the sky and land themselves in the middle of the ocean on a vessel. And you're telling me that we have nothing? A high technology country like ours has nothing to offer the world of shipbuilding? I just reject that idea. And then lastly, I just say, and what shipbuilding is there left to protect? I mean, like I said, we're at a point where our shipbuilding, in terms of large ocean-going ships, is on average 2 to 3 per year, and seems to be trending downwards. There's not 70% of shipbuilding revenue comes from the government contracts for the Navy, Coast Guard, et cetera, other government entities. It's not even commercial. So our commercial shrunk to such a minimal level. It would be hard not to improve upon the established record. If this isn't failure, I don't know what is.
I think that's a great point. Yeah. And it'd also be interesting. It's perhaps finally infrastructure week here in America. But it's interesting that, all of the talks of infrastructure, particularly I'm a big fan of rail. Mostly the biggest reason I'm a big fan of rail is because of the efficiencies you get with rail. Especially when it comes, like I'm a big proponent of, I'm trying to stop saying climate change and say ecological collapse, because I think that's a little more pointed to really what we're living through. I think climate change makes it seem like we're going to have a nice couple sunny days when the reality is life as we know it on Earth is fundamentally changing and irrecoverably. But anyways, rail is incredibly intensive to build, right? Like you have to have fixed lines and fixed routes.
You have to maintain the track, yeah,
and then you have to maintain it, and then you have so I've consulted in a lot of different industries, and one of them that I consulted in was agriculture once. And I was talking with them about like shipping seed from America to Brazil, and the numerous complexities that come with that. And I was like, oh man, this is really crazy. And one of the guys I was talking with was like, he laughed and he goes, I used to be in rail. He's like, you want to see what rail logistics is like? He's like, you're in for a treat. This is nothing. Because of the fact that you have a lot of single lanes and single tracks. So you have to be able to say like, okay, this is going to go east to west. And then, in another hour, it's going to go west to east. And what he was saying that was most interesting was He's like, the best trains, the best locomotives we have are actually the oldest. So he's like, so when something gets broken on it, he's like, imagine trying to reroute and figure out how to like the delays on that. So my point in bringing that up is, I think our infrastructure is needing a lot of attention, but when it comes to shipbuilding, all you need is a port, and you need an infrastructure. Our ports, there was a report that was out like 2 weeks ago talking about how the portable state of ports are in, and just the capacity issues that we have. So those definitely need to be retooled. But when it comes to building, with ships, you don't need to. It's less to consider because the water is there, right? You can ramp up into a shipbuilding, and maybe you have to get in some inefficiencies of offloading, or like what they're doing at Long Beach right now, because there's such a line of getting ships in there. They're coming up with a lot of smart ways to kind of unload faster and get things onto rail, and perhaps get it onto rail and get all this cargo out of the containers later. It seems to me that this is a huge missed opportunity to say, hey, let's figure out ways to ramp up shipping, domestic shipping, because of the fact that it doesn't need as much as like road infrastructure or rail infrastructure or even air infrastructure. Because I mean, airports and all of those things I just said are all everything is capital intensive when we're talking economies of this scale. But the time delta on them is a lot different than when it comes to shipping, because of the fact, like I said, the routes there you can figure out with AI and things like that, potentially even get it more efficient. So do you have any hope that anything is going to change anytime soon?
It's always advisable to be pessimistic on these matters. Again, policy has been what it is, arguably, for well over 200 years. The reason I do, that said, the reason I do have some hope here is that the failure is so glaring, and we've gotten to the point where it used to be that the shipbuilding interest, the labor unions, they employed a decent number of people, but they keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And you would think that there would be a commensurate reduction in their lobbying power. It used to be that you'd have these vast shipyards that employed lots of people. Well, geez, when it comes to commercial shipbuilding in this country, I mean, the number of people it employs is tiny. The entire domestic industry, I mean, you include the shipbuilders, you include the people that crew the ships. The whole Jones Act shipping industry is less than 100,000 people. You divide that by 50 states, and you're talking, it's less than 2,000 people per state. This is not a big industry, which is a shame, because you would think of how maritime and water oriented the United States is. And by the way, that 100,000, or actually I think it's like 95,000. I mean, the majority of that are guys in the Mississippi River pushing barges, in tugboats. This isn't actual ships. There are only 96 ships in the Jones Act fleet. So
Wow.
you just think that at some point, and yeah, if you go back to 1950, I think it was something like 440 ships, something like that. I think as recently as 1980, it was close to 200 ships. So the fleet keeps shrinking. Part of that's a reflection of ships have gotten bigger and you can do more with less. But hey, at the same time, our economy and our population has gotten so much bigger, yet that hasn't offset the decline in the fleet. So you live on the Great Lakes. Just to give you a sense of the shipbuilding there hasn't been a new ship built on the Great Lakes since 1983. They're currently building one now. I think it's supposed to be ready next year. It'll be the first ship built in 40 years. That's crazy. I mean, this is, again, there's not much of an industry left. There's increasingly less of an industry left to protect, and hopefully that'll produce an opening for some people to say, this isn't working. This is not working for us. And the people defending the status quo won't have the votes and the money behind them to exercise a veto on reform efforts. So it's not going to happen tomorrow or the year or even the day after that, or maybe even a few years from now. But I do think that we're going to come to a point where what are we doing here? What industry is there left to protect? And that'll open the door for new thinking.
Yeah, I'm cautiously pessimistic as well, though. I think you set the stage that you set could be a Shakespearean case study in how it's unlikely to happen. I mean, if 70% of their in the industry comes from government, that means it's actually incentivizing them to lobby more. And if there's less players, that means it's less of it's easier to get a consensus among the people who are there, which means it's easier to get money flowing into certain politicians to make sure that things happen. Also, I'm really curious. I would be curious to understand how many of those 95 or less than 100,000 individuals that are employed, what is their spread? Because my assumption, my kind of gut reaction is that they're probably localized to a handful of states, which means
Yes.
that lobbying power and how much those individual senators or congressmen are going to be fighting for this issue is going to be quite a bit more.
Yeah, so it is geographically concentrated. Especially again, the majority of our maritime industry in the United States is not ships. It is people working on tugboats and barges and smaller craft like that. So you're talking folks that operate on the Mississippi River, Louisiana. I wouldn't say they're a big shipbuilder because they don't really build ships, but they build smaller craft. Ferries, things like that you find down there. The Louisiana delegation will always be 100% support of the Jones Act. And one interesting thing to note about the politics of Jones Act reform is that some of the leading voices for Jones Act reform have come from landlocked states. John McCain of Arizona, Mike Lee of Utah, and some of the biggest proponents of the Jones Act, some of the fiercest supporters come from those places that are most hurt by the Jones Act, like Hawaii, like Alaska. The Alaska delegation, all three members are big-time Jones Act supporters. Both senators from Hawaii are both Jones Act supporters. There is one member of the Hawaii delegation that is an opponent of the Jones Act, Representative Ed Case, and he has said that his anti-Jones Act position, this is very counterintuitive, has been one of the hardest positions that he's taken. You would think that would be a no-brainer in Hawaii, especially when you look at opinion polls. There was a poll done, I believe, last year in Hawaii that showed among Hawaiians that are aware of the Jones Act, something like 85% either want to see the law repealed or reformed. Only 15%, it was 10 or 15% favored the status quo. And yet that is not reflected in the politics that we see because of the phenomenon of concentrated special interests and these dispersed costs. There are, I could name a dozen organizations that exist that basically to perpetuate the Jones Act and ensure that it stays on the books. But I can't think of one industry lobbying group that is geared, has one of its main purposes as opposing the Jones Act.
Yeah.
That's one of the depressing realities we have to contend with.
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot when I study policy issues. Is that most frequently the most harmful policy implications come from the least known, most highly opaque. Like this, I would say this is a fairly opaque issue, right? Like we
absolutely opaque.
Yeah, we've spent several minutes going from why was it started and to understanding like what happened, like what it is, and then the second and third and fourth order effects of it. So, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that Hawaii, one of the most remote regions of the world, which would benefit from this, right? Because now all of a sudden it would benefit in the sense that at least it would increase domestic trade with the rest of the contiguous U.S. or even maybe perhaps Alaska in some degree, as opposed to probably a lot of their goods being cheaper to import as well. I'm assuming because of this type of setup. It also doesn't surprise me that some of the landlocked states that just seems to me like the corporate interests or lobbying interest kind of getting into play there. But going back to like the infrastructure point though, the Mississippi. So like I've come from Chicago, and I've spent a lot of time in Minnesota. I have family up there all along the Mississippi. So I'm quite familiar with it. The analog I've been thinking about lately with it is it's like the American Nile, because, the Nile is used as a shipping because it's just so many settlements, so much of, I mean, like if you just look at the Mississippi, you have St. Paul up there, and then you kind of keep going down and you have cities upon cities that are still built with St. Louis and all of that. But beyond that, a lot of agriculture or industry that gets developed in any of the states along there use that as the main navigable way to get goods down, which makes sense to me that our only domestic market for ships anymore is along the Mississippi. But it would be curious to me what our industry would change if we were in some way opening up the market. Would more intercoastal shipping happen? Particularly maybe this just because I recently moved from Southern California. It'd be curious to me how much of the West Coast, the Western seaboard, would be ships going up and back. Because I mean, I can tell you, I can't tell you how many times it'd be any time of day that I'm driving on the 5 on the West Coast and any part of California, and it's filled with trucks all day and night. And actually, it's funny, in Southern California, you think oh, okay, I'm gonna shift the time that I'm going to be driving at 10 o'clock at night and see if that changes the traffic, and it doesn't, because now you just have trucks. So it'd be curious to me how much our infrastructure would shift if we had this. We have an example with the Mississippi, where it's navigable. It's there for us. It's well put out route. There's years of infrastructure and commerce that kind of go along with it. I wonder if new things would emerge, particularly in the age of climate change, ecological collapse, where we're constantly looking for more efficiencies. I would strike to find that I bet we'd have a lot more efficiencies. And I'll plug AI again if we can just say hey, look, these are the currents. This is the various places we want to stop. What would be the most efficient route between those if we were using water passageways?
Yeah, I think that there's absolutely an opportunity there. It's interesting to look at Europe as kind of an analog of the United States because of a different policy regime. Cabotage is allowed among EU members. And of course, you can buy vessels from any country. There's no domestic build requirement. And in the EU, coastal shipping accounts for, I believe, something like 40% of freight movement. In the United States, ships account for 2% of freight movement. You add in barges, and I think you're looking at 6-7%, something like that. Now, obviously, policy isn't the only determinant of how much coastal shipping gets used. You have to look at just your geographical disposition, obviously geographic factors there. Europe lends itself very well to the use of shipping, particularly between Scandinavia, the UK, say going from Spain to Italy or Greece. It makes a lot of sense to put something on a ship. But I don't think the U.S. We're lacking. Our geography doesn't lend itself or is anti-shipping. So I'm not going to say that we would go to 40%, but hey, why not 10%? Why not 15%? I think Jones Act reform is a huge part of the puzzle there. Also, you spoke about California. Another piece of the puzzle, I think you need Jones Act reform, and we need to upgrade our ports. Our port handling costs are far higher than in many other countries. You compare Shanghai, Singapore, Rotterdam, and these ports are running 24/7, all highly automated, versus U.S. ports. You look at the ILWU labor union. Some of these guys working out in these West Coast ports make hundreds of thousands of dollars, very well paid, very well compensated, highly unionized, highly resistant to change. So if we could get efficient ports merged with efficient shipping, yeah. I'm not going to say the I-5 would be empty of trucks, but I think you would see an appreciable difference.
Yeah. I definitely could agree with that. It's something else that I would like to plug as far as the European example there, the European plateau, if you will, is we often look at America as homogenous. And it's really not, both in culture, I would even such to say that, but also in geography. So if we're going to, say what percentage of our entire domestic, infrastructure and trade should be done by shipping, it's wow, well, I don't even know what it would change to, but I bet regionally it would change quite a bit. Like the Gulf going from, maybe not the Gulf because the geography isn't that much, but definitely In the Great Lakes region, I would imagine that shipping would go up quite a bit. I would imagine it would go up quite a bit again on the West Coast, because the geography there makes it incredibly difficult to move things either by rail or by road. Because I mean, like, once again, like, I living out in Southern California, it was always striking to me where I'd be like, oh, something's 45 miles away. Okay, cool. It's like 45 minutes. That's awesome. And then I look at the GPS and it's like 2 hours. It's like, what? And it's because all these passageways and foothills and mountains on Earth you have to deal with is quite...
And traffic.
And traffic. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, just traffic. Yeah. If we had some kind of congestion tax, that would probably also help promote alternative transportation uses.
Yeah, it's very Scandinavian of you as well. But
one thing I just want to butt in a little bit. You mentioned the Great Lakes, and I think that's a really interesting example because, again, I mentioned that there hasn't been a new ship built in 40 years in the Great Lakes. Well, ships are like anything else, like cars or airplanes, where the newest is the best. It has the latest technology. A car today versus a car 20 years ago. Now think a car today versus a car 40 years ago and the differences. And the Jones Act, and particularly the U.S. built requirement, is just a severe disincentive to modernization of the fleet. If we had just get rid of the build requirement, you would see an influx of new tonnage in the Jones Act fleet. You would see updated, modernized vessels. Presumably, modernized means more efficient. More efficient means lower prices, which means greater attractiveness for their use. Canada, I think, is very interesting natural experiment there, where it used to be that Canada had, I think, a 25% tax on the importation of large ships. And then back in like 2010, 2011, they got rid of that. You can import them tax-free. Well, guess what? Canada has been buying new ships left and right for their Great Lakes fleet. And I think one company alone, like Algoma, Algoma Central, they bought like 10 new ships over the last 8 years or so. Whereas again, Americans have had 0 new ships. And they've highlighted that's not just good from an economic perspective in terms of environmental degradation, in terms of pollution. These are far superior to the ships that they're replacing. That is a good in and of itself right there. Yep. And again, if you think that we're facing a climate emergency, this absolutely has to be on the table as part of the solution.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. So I'm a car nut, right? And I have a incredibly souped up Subaru. So I drive a Subaru that
I have no car.
You're even better than me. That I can't claim to be as much of an environmental nut when I have this 20 PSI turbocharged Subaru. But the thing that I often say to people when they, like, one time I rented a Dodge Charger. I was on a business trip and I had just how do I put this delicately? I used to be a consultant. So I had this coffee cup and it was protect our wild rivers or wild waters or something like that is what it was. And it was part of this alliance that wants to more smartly protect our waterways, because if we just think, oh, let's put a dam in here, that's going to get energy out of this. But there's a lot of other order effects that come from damming. And you're seeing it a lot in Washington State, actually. Particularly the salmon. A lot of salmon are just distinct subspecies have just completely vanished. And then when that leaves, you have all these different effects with the ecosystem. So someone brought it up, like, what is this? And I kind of went on this environmental rant. I was a little over caffeinated from the coffee in the cup. And so then later on in that evening, I picked up somebody to go get some dinner, and they were like, you have a Charger? Why'd you rent a Charger? I would have thought you would like rented a Prius or something. And the comment I made back was, most cars that are built today, that Charger is one of them. My car is another one. My car is what they call a partial zero emission vehicle. So yes, it has an internal combustion engine. Yes, it burns and has carbon into the atmosphere, but the amount that it's emitting is very small compared to what it is now. I'm not a proponent for gasoline engines. I think we should go electric as fast as we can. I'm accepting the fact that I'm not going to have a manual very often anymore. It's kind of a fate, and I think it's where we should go. But right now, if you buy a new car versus buying a 10-year-old car, even, it is so much better for the environment. than it was then. So yes, like we should shift towards more electrification, but we also have to be recognizing that there's ways to get better than what we have now. And particularly shipping to me is most interesting because container ships, like international container ships, are some of the worst polluters, because of just they essentially take like the lowest grade of fuel, and they have a lot of particulates in there when they burn. So I would imagine a shipping fleet of domestic ships that's as old as ours is. All 96 of them, I would imagine, are not necessarily the most efficient or best on the environment. But to kind of look at this in a more positive lighting, that actually is a huge opportunity for us to be both the leaders in more efficient and better for the environment ships, but also kind of reset again and have a fleet that is built of something that is not as pollutant in the environment. Or I think it's Norway is playing around with electric power-trained
Yeah.
ships.
Yeah, I think ships that run on ammonia or something like.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's where a lot of the innovation is coming out of, in autonomous shipping. Yeah, a lot of high
Right.
technology is being devoted to shipping in Norway.
Yeah, no, and like the Chevy Volt, going back to GM being not the greatest run, I'm a really big fan of their architecture. I don't know if you're familiar with that vehicle, but so it's an electric car. So the powertrain, what is pushing you forward? So like I'm gonna compare it to a Prius, and maybe you'll understand why I got a Charger instead of a Prius. So in a Prius, it's actually an internal combustion car that occasionally has an electric secondary motor that will move you along, and it'll use the alternator from the combustion engine to recharge the battery, which then puts it's essentially a golf cart. It's actually it's funny. It is the exact same architecture as a golf cart. If you have any of these Cushman golf carts that you see, and on golf courses, or people ride towards the beach where I live, they're at slow speeds, or when you're like barely giving the gas, you're moving on electric, and all of a sudden you hear that, and that's the internal combustion engine. It's the exact same architecture as a Prius. A Chevy Volt, which I'm sad that didn't get enough sales. It kind of, GM in my eyes kind of intentionally killed that car. It was different. So it had an internal combustion engine. It had like a very small 4-cylinder. I think you could probably do this with a motorcycle engine, but it had a small 4-cylinder. But the powertrain, what was pushing you forward, was 100% always electric. So it was always moving you forward from an electric motor. And then when the battery was dying down, the internal combustion engine would kick in. But the thing is that there's a computer controlling all of it. So like there's all these power bands that you'll see for like torque and horsepower and efficiencies on combustion engines. So what it would do is it would kick up the RPMs to be the most peak efficiency in the power band, where the amount of fuel that you're burning per hour matches the peak amount of energy that this engine could produce. So instead of you having, to have an internal combustion engine come in and push you forward, you're always running on the most efficient way possible. So instead, yes, you're still running a gas engine, but instead of a Prius getting you like 60 or 70 miles a gallon, us going, oh my God, that's crazy. These Volts were getting 300 miles a gallon. I think 270 is what the EPA listed it at. But I've seen several reviews you can go on where people are getting 300 plus. And that's just because, once again, it's more efficient because of the architecture of like what you see with Teslas. How are you able to go 0 to 60 so fast? It's because, electricity moves a lot faster than gears and motors, and you lose energy in every stage of the thing, where with this, it's just going to go forward. So this is something I've thought for years now, is why don't you lift that Chevy Volt architecture and put it into shipping? Because shipping, you need high torque, which is why they use diesel in order to get you going, because, moving a propeller through water it's a highly viscous solution. It's very hard to do it. And every time you shift that propeller, you're actually losing energy as what you're putting in. So in my eyes, experimenting with some of these ship architectures and things could be a natural place for government to step in and try to encourage an industry in new ways, especially with our kind of environmental situation, as opposed to where we are now and maintaining this status quo. But perhaps I'm just dreaming of better architectures, and much of this isn't going to come.
Well, I don't know, what the best or optimal solution is, what forms of power our ships should be using. I know there's a lot of experimentation out there with liquefied natural gas is pretty popular right now, but there are also competing forms of energy. And I don't know what the best is, but I know that whatever it is, that the Jones Act is a deterrent to the adoption of that technology. It's a deterrent to fleet modernization. This is a law that says that when you all buy a new ship, you need to pay 4 or 5 times a higher price. So people hold on to older ships for longer than would otherwise be the case. So whenever that new technology comes out, we'll be some of the last ones to get it because you make it so prohibitively expensive to adopt that technology. And that just seems obviously wrong and failed policy.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. That's a huge miss. I mean, it's America is the. I mean, I hope that this trend doesn't change now that I'm saying it out loud. We are the most innovative. I there's a lot of things about our country like culturally or economically or governmentally that I can kind of shout at the sun about. But I think one of the things that I think we live in an increasingly pessimistic world. I think that's unfortunate. I think reality is what we make of it and how we perceive it. And I think the world is getting more pessimistic. But with COVID, we definitely we left a lot to be desired in the managing of COVID, and both in the beginning and throughout, I would say. But regardless, something that I don't think is getting enough attention is we were able to produce a solution rather quickly.
That's amazing. Oh yeah,
yeah,
I absolutely, 100% agree.
Yeah, and I think actually, so I'm curious to see how the experiment with the mRNA vaccines go out and the efficacy and kind of any things like that, because it is in large ways an experiment. It's safe as we know it, and it hasn't been done before, and that's what I mean by experiment. Because if this works with this, it opens up a whole new amount of things.
Oh yeah, it's a whole new world.
Yep.
Yeah.
I read something recently that a friend of mine who's a doctor sent to me about potentially this being like literally a cure for cancer, mRNA vaccines, because of what it could do as far as sequencing. But the other thing is that I think it was early 2020 was actually when the mRNA vaccine was conceived and developed, and then the rest of the time was testing it to make sure that it was the right.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. I think it was a matter of weeks. When it was developed. Yeah.
Right. And how did that happen? So this is also something interesting in that article that my friend sent me. It explained it, and essentially mRNA was never getting the funding that it needed because of the concerns of it being unsafe and unproven, and essentially the promise. How can I put this? So the promise of it was so wide that no one believed it. So it was like, well, you got to show me it. So the other analog I would give you is blockchain. So I used to work a lot in blockchain when it was, I think like 5 years ago or so, when it was really this big technology. But the thing that would always go to any of my clients was, there isn't a big hit that has shown what the technology could do, right? There wasn't, the Walmarts of the world haven't come up with a solution that everyone can point to and say like, oh, that is how you use it. Now we're kind of seeing it with NFTs, which I wasn't expecting, which I think is pretty interesting. But the mRNA needed a reason to get funding. Now, I think it was, I won't even go down the road of what I was going to say, but they proved it. There was funding that was given. There was money that was given. Government stepped in and said, hey, we're going to give you this to develop it. And now look, like we have a vaccine that, if you look at the numbers, I think it's pretty obvious that it's working as far as keeping our contagion low, especially considering that it would, more states were opening up at this kind of nexus point. So we can innovate. And I mean, everything from that all the way through just, giving people money and direct stimulus and kind of the effects of that. Like we can innovate in a lot of ways, but a lot of times that is going to require us to step away from the status quo and get out of our own way. And I think this is another area in which we can do it. Like, if you take the pessimistic route and say, look, like America isn't doing this well, we're falling behind. We got to hold on to what we have left, or we can take a more optimistic bend and say, well, we can innovate. Let's just try to set the conditions in a lab in such a way that what we get is something better than what we have currently.
Yeah. Yeah, 100% agree. We need to get out of our comfort zone. Again, the current policy environment is just the product of status quo bias. And well, we're doing it this way because this is the way we've always done it. And there's no rigorous analysis applied to this or critical thought. The policy discussion within the halls of Congress is an echo chamber typically. And yeah, something needs to shake this up. There, yeah, it all needs to be rethought, and there needs to be something that shakes us out of our current slumber, and makes us wake up to the possibilities that could be realized if we had a change in the policy environment.
What would you do if I gave you a magic wish to do a couple policy changes? What would you do, and what do you think the effects would be?
Well, obviously, I would just say, repeal the Jones Act, but let's think. One, I'll say maybe a problem with this issue or the discussion is it's usually framed in binary terms. Do we keep it or do you get rid of it? But there's a whole host of options between full repeal and maintaining the status quo that I think are deserving of being entertained and discussed, and that could make an appreciable impact. I think that short of repealing the law, a hugely useful step would be just get rid of that U.S. built requirement. Allow Americans to shop for vessels from foreign countries, just like they can shop for autos, for trucks, for rail, for airplanes, anything else. That's not just good economic policy. I'm someone that believes in individual liberty. I think that as a free person, I should be able to buy a product from any country I want for use, provided it's safe, meets certain regulations. I'm totally fine with that. That I think would do a huge amount to unleash the potential of the U.S. maritime sector. We have a current policy where we make it extremely expensive to buy new ships, and we wonder why the maritime sector is a mess, why we have an old fleet, why it keeps shriveling. The answers seem fairly obvious and apparent. So that would be, one thing. Another thing we could do is just hand out exemptions to, say, Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, if there's a lot of talk about admitting Puerto Rico as a U.S. state. If Puerto Rico was to be admitted, it would be easily the poorest U.S. state on a per capita GDP measurement, maybe poorer than Mississippi by some distance. So why do we have a policy that says we need a U.S. merchant marine for our military, so we have to use ships? And oh, by the way, we're going to stick a huge portion of the bill to Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico being one of the poorest parts of the United States. That's just, forget efficiency and everything else. That's just not fair. And if this truly is something that's supposed to benefit all Americans for our collective national security, then we should all collectively pay for it equally, and it should not be a burden that is wildly disproportionately put upon these areas like Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico should be exempted. And Puerto Rico is 3 million people, and it would serve as a nice natural experiment. I think a lot of people, they're concerned or they're hesitant to do such a massive change in policy. Well, we could do this and have it serve as an example. And then we could go back, after 5 years, after 10 years, what has it achieved? Have there been any shortcomings? What are the lessons learned here? And then if it is the overall positive experience, I think it would be, then that would, logically generate momentum for, okay, let's extend that to Hawaii. Let's extend that to Alaska. Maybe let's extend it to the rest of the United States. I'm all for incrementalism. What really boggles my mind is that there's been absolutely zero progress for so long in the face of policy that is such a manifest failure in so many ways.
Yeah, I was talking with the head of the Nuclear Commission for the Marshall Islands, Ria Moss Christian, and she said that the agreement between the Marshall Islands and the United States is manifestly inaccurate. Oh, I'm sorry, manifestly incomplete, or what did she say? Inadequate, manifestly inadequate. And I would say that that's the same with this. Like from the manifest, from the beginning of this, it was inadequate to what needed to be done. And I think I love the idea of using this kind of incrementalism with Puerto Rico because, as our further climate change reality and ecological collapse becomes more apparent, Puerto Rico is going to feel that the most, or one of the most of any of the areas, because it's, an island, so rising seas. It's in a hurricane zone. Warmer oceans means more hurricanes, more intense hurricanes, and giving them a little bit of relief in the means of getting them goods. I mean, even with the hurricane that hit there, one of the big problems was logistics and getting people there.
Sure.
I was reading something of they had no shortage of volunteers. Like, people were able to fly in, get off the plane, but then when they were going to wherever they were reporting to volunteer and help, they would get there and there'd be no supplies. Which I'm curious, how much this had to play with it. I would imagine it had something to play with it, not being able to get any goods out there. So that's really interesting. I think it's a great point. Do you have any other thoughts as far as I don't things that the government can do to stimulate? So the intent of the law is to make sure that we have, in cases of emergency, enough shipping capacity, which we see right now is actually it's actually creating the opposite effect. Because I mean, if you needed a ship and you bought it from Japan or South Korea or Rotterdam or anywhere else, all of a sudden, if you needed it, well, it doesn't matter where the ship came from. We have it now and we need it now. So I guess going back to my question, is there anything that the intent of the law is to, have us have a stable industry in case of emergency? Could you see anything else that we could do to actually create those types of situations, as opposed to the situation we're in now, where we're kind of fighting a losing battle, except unless you live along the Mississippi Delta?
Well, I am an advocate for repeal of the law, but I also think that it should be paired with the implementation of measures that would actually achieve the aims that the Jones Act is supposed to achieve, like having sufficient shipping, like having a shipbuilding capacity, and having mariners to crew our ships in time of war. I'm not someone that is blind or oblivious to the needs of the U.S. military, and I think that those are legitimate needs that need to be accommodated and provided for. So how do we do this? Well, right now there's already a program called the Maritime Security Program, and what this is it's 60 ships, and these are non-Jones Act ships. So right now there are 180 U.S. flagged ocean-going ships, and 96 of those are Jones Act ships, meaning they're U.S. built. There are 84 foreign-built U.S. flagged ships. Now, because they're foreign-built, these are U.S. crewed, U.S. flagged ships, but they can't operate within the United States. So these are ships that exclusively operate internationally, going between U.S. ports and foreign ports. And that MSP program I mentioned of 60 ships, they're entirely drawn from that pool of 84 foreign-built ships. And basically the way it works is each of those ships is paid $5 million a year. And then in exchange for that $5 million, the government reserves the right to call upon that ship and use it in time of war or national emergency. So I would say, let's go to the Pentagon and say, guys, how many ships do you need? How much capacity do you need? And then they say, we need X number of ships. And I say, well, let's make sure we get X number of ships. And whatever that number is, let's fund it with subsidies like that. And in fact, I think I would probably tweak it a little bit and say, okay, we need X number of ships, and have companies bid and say, okay, in exchange for X amount of money, I will provide you the ships, and bid it out like that. Another thing we could do is form like a merchant marine reserve. Like I mentioned very early on in this conversation, it's kind of a guessing game as to how many mariners we would have available in time of war to crew our ships. In fact, in 2017, there was a report done, I believe, for the U.S. Maritime Administration, and they calculated that there would be a shortage. They said, we have X number of mariners out there. Here's how many we need, and that's a shortage, but they said this is a best case scenario, assuming all of those mariners actually show up and say, yes, I'm willing to serve, because they do serve on a volunteer basis. According to the report, I think the phrase they use is that the actual number is beyond prediction because of that voluntary nature. Well, I think the U.S. military and national security should be playing a guessing game as to how many mariners we'd have available. So form like a merchant marine reserve where there is some kind of contractual obligation in exchange for some kind of wage or some kind of funding, some kind of subsidy. You receive this money, and then in exchange, in time of war, we can grab you and use you, and therefore we eliminate that uncertainty. So these are some of the measures that I think we should adopt. And then the U.S. built requirement, and if we got rid of that, there really is no downside there, because again, what's sustaining the U.S. shipbuilding industry to the extent we have it today, it's not the Jones Act, it's those government contracts, and that's not going anywhere. These are, again, this building for the Navy, the Coast Guard, we're going to continue to do that. There's limited downside, and theoretically, it should promote an increased number of ships, because if ships get, you can buy them for 1/5 the price, you get more of them. So the price of something goes down, you get more of it. And along with more ships would come more mariners. So that just seems to me to be almost 100% upside. So those are some of the thoughts that I have around that.
Yeah, that's great. I like that. I like those ideas a lot. The reserve part of it, I think, is a great idea. I'm surprised we haven't done that before.
And this is not just me dreaming this up. There actually have been people in the past. I think there's like a GAO report I came across from the 1990s that proposed something like this, and it wouldn't even require big money. These aren't huge expenditures you're talking about. Obviously the Army, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. You don't need hundreds of thousands of mariners. If we could just get a pool of 10 to 15,000 that we knew would be dependable, that would probably be sufficient for our purposes. So this doesn't have to be some massive expenditure. And I think the economic gains from Jones Act reform would pay for all this stuff that I'm talking about. So I think it's just a win. The increased efficiency would pay for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point too. The other one that you said about like the bidding and kind of having this contracted out, one of the reasons that I am such a proponent of like individual liberties and really maximizing individual freedoms is if you make the conditions good for individuals, that's actually the most efficient way of having something organized, right? Like it's much more efficient that you have citizens that are paying into taxes or, abiding by some type of common fare, common moral order than it is to have police or any other agents or actors come in and kind of make sure that everything is held in place. And the other thing I would say with that is, when we went to the moon, we didn't mandate certain things needed to be done certain ways or produced in certain areas. We said, like, this is what we're looking to build. This is what we need. Who can contract out and do this? And then all of a sudden, all these companies sprang up, and then efficiencies were gained because it's not, a mandate. This is what the requirements are, and this is what we need, and then we can create something that's better. So I think being able to have the type of setup in this, the most tragic, in a true Shakespearean tragedy, just to plug Shakespeare again. I've been thinking about Shakespeare a lot, which really is no different than my normal days. Anyways, is this the conditions of this Jones Act, such as they are today, and the poor state in which our fleet is, such as it is today, is actually the best opportunity to improve things to be orders of magnitude and exponentially better, if we can just disrupt the status quo and make an opaque issue become clear, and have some type of path forward. But I think it requires bravery in a rather banal area, and banal not in the sense it's boring. I find this is fascinating, but it's banal as in it takes mental effort and narrative to be able to get it to a way that affects me, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's not super intuitive. Yeah, I think to me, this is a law that is extremely impactful, and most people don't realize it. Most people don't even know it exists. And that is, of course, one of the challenges. On its surface, it's this obscure shipping law, whatever. But then when you really dive into it and dig deep, you go, wow, I think there are major gains to be had here from a change to the policy environment. And that's certainly been kind of my experience, at least. At first, you think this is an annoying, silly law. And then the more you dig into it, you think, wow, this is absolutely crazy. And there are some potentially huge gains to be had here with the right policy changes.
Yeah, it scares me to think how much that exact playbook that you just said exists across all
Absolutely.
of them.
Absolutely. That's another key lesson here is you can't think that, the Jones Act is the one screwed up policy we have. I'm sure this dynamic plays itself out over and over and over again. And that really is scary. Yeah,
it definitely is. Well, I want to get us out here at a decent time. I didn't get to ask you anything about labor because I think that's a missing component in here. So I'll at least just plug it. Is that I'm really curious, and maybe next time we talk, I'll ask you some more questions on the labor side of this, because 75% foreign, I'm sorry, 75% requirements of them being citizens, and the other 25% had to be at least permanent residents, is I believe what you said.
Yes.
That's also fascinating to me. I also, just to cue it back up again, I think it's an interesting point that American shipbuilders are actually some of the lowest paid in the world, which probably goes back to how much they're constrained and from capital resources and all of that. So a lot of interesting stuff. Thank you again for your time. Before we can wrap in a second, but is there anything else you wanted to mention while we were on there?
No, I think that's about it. We spent a lot of time digging into this, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do such a deep dive. Usually, the issue is given a fairly superficial treatment, and I'm thankful for the ability to get to explore this a little bit more and dive into some of the details. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much as well. I appreciate your time as well as talking to me about this. I think this is, I encourage anyone who's listening to scratch the surface more on policy issues. And kind of the narratives that we hear come from politicians or, in the wild, which more often than not, it comes from some special interest group. Once you kind of start scratching and digging a little bit deeper, it starts becoming this really interesting narrative. And a lot of the reasons why I say that I like watching basketball is because I feel like the narrative that unfolds is often stranger than one we can write. I think the same is true of policy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to stop the recording, but thank you very much.
Thank you.